Serious, Redditors who've had loved ones mysteriously disappear. What was it like? How has it affected your life, your relationships, your worldview? My sister and I were born 9 years apart. We didn't get along very well, stupid kid brother, until she moved out on her own. Just about every weekend she picked me up and we ran the streets of Hollywood in the 60s. We'd hitchhike from one end of Sunset Boulevard to the other, stopping to hang out in front of the whiskey or on our favorite corner on Sunset and Crescent Heights where we could make a quick couple of bucks hawking the LA Free Press to passing motorists. We got a nickel out of each sale. My sister disappeared a few years later. She had moved to Detroit and all contact ceased. A year or so later my mother got a call from the Detroit Department of Social Services about my sister's young daughter. The child had been left with a babysitter and her mother never returned. My sister's H addiction swallowed her up. 2 decades later we were reunited. A long and strange story in itself. She was still strung out but back in LA. I met her briefly, then she got arrested and spent 2 years in one of Grey Bar resorts. She managed to get clean in prison and stayed that way for 5 years. She was diagnosed with cancer and I used every spare minute to drive her to and from her appointments. After a particularly brutal radiation treatment, the doctor called us into his office and told us that he had done all he could do and it was time to get her affairs in order. We drove home in silence. It was the longest drive of my life. 2 months later her body could take no more. The cancer had spread from her kidneys to her brain and extinguished the spark. I felt horribly cheated. This was many years ago and not a day passes that I don't miss her dearly. When I was a preteen, my grandfather, mom's dad, left signed divorce papers on the kitchen table and took off. For several years we had no idea where he went, but we knew he was still alive because he sent us birthday cards and Christmas presents without any return address. I almost think it would have been better if he didn't send anything at all. It really felt like he taunted us and it destroyed my mother and her siblings. A few years later, he showed up at my birthday party. That went over well. I kind of want to know what happened at that birthday party. One of my best friends recently disappeared. She told me the night of her son's first birthday that she had a stalker. He would send pictures of her out and about so she'd know that he was following her and knew where she lived. He allegedly would threaten her with hurting her son and family if she didn't run away with him. I didn't take her seriously at first. It all seemed like a massive lie to me because she seemed too calm when telling me about it. And she had said that it had been going on and off for a year now. But she failed to mention it to me when we've been best friends since we were 6. The next day she disappeared. Her phone was off. She failed to show up to work. And all her social media had been erased. We were worried sick. We didn't know where to look for her. The police wouldn't help. We couldn't get her phone records. Nothing. We thought the worst. That she had been kidnapped or killed. Or that she ran away with this guy. But then one day out of the blue, she called. She called to admit that she lied about everything. That she was sick of everyone back home. Sick of being a young mom. Sick of working. And that she needed time to be by herself. So she ran off with her lover, the alleged stalker, to Mexico. But the only reason she called was because she ran out of money and needed help from her parents. TLDR. Friend made up a story about having a stalker so her family and husband would think she got kidnapped, so she wouldn't have to tell them that she was running away with her lover. As I started reading this, that was my very first thought, that she was planning to disappear and was laying pipe, so to speak, with the stalker story. Holy crap, this happened to me. I was living with a boyfriend in college for about a year, and he was acting really strange before he left for work in the morning. He was never a very physically loving guy, but he was just straight up cold to me. He never came home. All of his stuff was left. I filed a missing persons report and it was years later before I found out he just moved to Mexico. But those years were pretty awful. When I was in grade 5, around 8-9 years old, we had this kid in our class named Charlie who was a refugee from Sierra Leone. He was an extremely funny and gifted kid. He could draw the most insane stuff from the top of his mind. He was a very popular kid. And then from one day to another he wasn't there anymore. We heard a couple of weeks later that he and his family, mother and little sister I believe, were deported back to Africa. I still think about him from time to time, because Sierra Leone isn't really a country where you can have the opportunities like you have in the Netherlands. I really wonder what happened to him. I had a child in my classroom who was sent back to the Caribbean. Her mother had been a prostitute there because she was illiterate, but she was getting help and education here in Canada. Then, they were just sent back. I really hope and pray her mother had enough education here to get a good job back where they were from. But I worry, the little girl would be 11 now. Had a distant relative, who in the 1950s, went out to get a loaf of bread. He was gone for 40 years. He came back one day out of the blue. He had been living in Florida with a second family. The whole joke was, did he get the bread? This would have been amazing if he turned up after 40 years and actually brought a loaf of bread with him. My aunt disappeared in 1975 at the chili cook-off in Terlingua, Texas. My mother's younger sister. I think I have very vague memories of her, but can't be sure. She lived with us briefly in Germany, got pregnant with her German boyfriend and gave her daughter up for adoption in West Texas. Then she went with some friends to the chili cook-off, and they last reported seeing her sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck while they tried to tear down some of an old mine trestle to build a fire. When they looked up, she was gone. They figured she'd be back, but she never came back. There was never any tangible evidence found. The only clue that seemed promising to my mother was a report that came in from a woman who was a prostitute who told police she'd been sitting in the back of a car when something about my aunt came on the radio, provoking the two guys sitting up front to say that they'd raped her and tied her up and thrown her in a stock tank. A stock tank is a small pond for cattle to drink in. There are hundreds and hundreds all over that part of Texas. My mother and I went back there 30 years later to try to spark some interest in this now almost forgotten case. When we stopped by the adoption agency, we found out my aunt's daughter had left contact information a few months before. Now she and my mom are close. She looks like her mother, has several beautiful and smart kids, and seems to have a happy life. We were never able to locate her father. I had a former roommate disappear decades ago. Let's call her June. June was a bit of a lost soul. She had been an orphan since 13 and drifted around. She rarely remembered to pay her share of the rent, so in the end I moved out. About a year later she disappeared without a trace. There were no clues. An abandoned car was found with a lot of blood in the backseat outside of town, but it might not have been related. 5 years later she turns up in town, alive, and I have to identify her over the phone so she can access her now frozen bank account. She doesn't want to see me. 3 weeks later she makes the news when she is arrested for abandoning her young child in another town. In the end she is deemed mentally unfit, probably true, and does not go to jail. A year later I am in line at Target and I notice a smelly homeless looking woman in front of me. She's unusual in that a child is with her. She turns and says something to the child and I recognize her. It's June. Don't know if this counts, or if it's even true, but I once met a guy in a pub who claimed to have an exit plan. Can't remember how the topic came up, but he told me that he had a secret bank account with enough money to live on for 6 months in it, and a car and a bunch of clothes and other essentials in storage somewhere. It was all just sitting there, waiting, and if he ever needed to, he could just walk out of his life at any moment and never look back. He said he had a wife and 2 young kids. He seemed well off and quite articulate. I asked him if it felt deceitful to go behind his wife's back like that, like he wasn't fully committed to the relationship or something, and he said that actually it was completely the opposite. Because he had the option to leave at any point, it meant he knew he was in his current situation because he knew he wanted to be, not because he felt he had to be. Strange. This guy sounds like my so. It wouldn't surprise me if I found out he had an exit plan, but he'd likely have a reason similar to the above. Come to think of it, So's father is also the same. One of my cousins recently vanished, and it ultimately turned out he, along with his wife and kids, one from her previous relationship, had fled to Ecuador after getting her senile grandfather to sign over power of attorney, then selling his house and taking all the money for themselves. At first I was just baffled that he and his entire family had just disappeared apparently without trace. Once the whole story came out I was just disappointed and embarrassed to be related to him. I feel bad for her grandfather, but I must admit I also get a kick out of the fact my cousin ran away to Ecuador to hide from his mother-in-law. Friend did this. I was going to school and had a friend that was in a play with me. He was new to the school but older, late 20s. He drove a BMW and always bought dinner and drinks. One day the cast goes to club and we carpool with him. We are ready to go and nobody can find him. We call his cell, it doesn't pick up. After a while we figure a way to get home. Drama before Uber, I digress. Anyways, we were pee but figured he hooked up with someone. Try to call him the next couple days. Nothing. Go to the next rehearsal, director says he spoke to the guy and he quit the play. Never see him at school, go to his house and his place is empty. Never found out what happened to him. I was the one who disappeared. Back in first grade, I had a best friend and my parents didn't tell me I was moving until the very last day when my friend and I were watching a movie and we heard a loud truck. I didn't get to say goodbye to my friend. I still think about her every now and then. Judith, if you're out there, I still think of you. Bro, I had something really similar happen to me, except it was second grade. One of my best friends was just gone when third grade started. No one told me anything. I vaguely remember someone saying he moved. I think about him all the time. Your comments give me hope that he does the same. Another story. I once worked at a well-known financial firm. Not Madoff. The head of auditing was the nicest guy. One day he vanished. The next day the entire auditing department was fired except for the most recent hire. It was her first week on the job and she had noticed the oddest thing about the suspense accounts, which she had immediately reported to his boss. Oh yeah, about $2 million and his whole family disappeared too. My aunt has been missing for a little over 10 years. She suffers from schizophrenia and would often disappear for a few years at a time after going off her meds. She had moved to Vegas at one point and then disappeared again. After another couple of years her sister moved to Vegas also and found her living in a group home. She was medicated and doing well, but over time with prolonged interaction with her family she started to slip into the darkness of her mind. She ended up going off her meds again and barricaded herself in my cousin's closet because she wanted to live in it. Schizophrenia is a heck of a drug. She was forcibly removed and hospitalized and placed back into her group home. She then ran away from there and no one has been able to find her. There was an investigation if I recall, but it turned up nothing. She doesn't even know her parents are dead and it is a big cause of sadness for her siblings. She would be in her 60s at this point. We don't even know if she is alive or in a safe place. I suspect she might be one of those homeless people who lives under a bridge and screams inanities at passerbys. Whenever I see such a person in whatever part of the country I'm in, I take a close look. You never know if it could be her or not, especially when you consider that the one time I met her she had been sent by plane from Jerusalem by the US consulate. I think she had been found wandering over there and in her mind she was going to stop the fighting in the Middle East. I was 6 years old and believed all her crazy stories. I hope she is safe. I have a ridiculous story. I met a guy on OkCupid way back when. We had a magical first date. Totally clicked. He was from a small Midwestern town and loved his mom. Really great guy. After the date I went back to my car, shut the door, and actually I am the least girly girl the world has ever known, so it was kind of a big deal. We emailed back and forth all through the day and texted all evening. The next week he asked me out to lunch and I obliged. Again, it was wonderful. We made plans that weekend for me to make dinner on Friday night and to watch a movie, and to go for a hike on Sunday. Friday comes. We eat dinner and watch a movie at my apartment. The whole time, my roommate's cat, who hates everyone, is all over this guy. He's my dog's new best friend. It was like I was dating Snow White or something. After the movie, we bone. I had never slept with anyone that early on in a relationship and I felt a little bad, but this guy was exceptional, right? Shortly after we finish, he says that he has to get up really early the next morning, which I already knew, so he can't stay over. Great, I prefer having my bed to myself. I walk him to the front door, where the animals come running up to him. My roommate's cat blocks the door and keeps rubbing against his legs. "Don't worry, little buddy," he says. "I'll see you soon." He then looks at me, asks me to text him with details for our hike on Sunday, gives me a big kiss, and heads out the door. The next morning I send him a text about Sunday. He doesn't respond. Later in the day I log on to chat and he suddenly disappears. Sucker blocked me. For about a week I painstakingly played through every moment of that night. trying to figure out what happened before sending him an email saying that I knew that he didn't owe me anything, but an explanation would be pretty sweet. Nothing. 8 weeks. And another awful dating experience later, I was sitting in a coffee shop with a friend, telling her my most recent dating drama, when I received a text from that guy. One simple question. Any chance you'd be up for a threesome? I'm sorry, but that was hilarious. The cat part got me. My aunt disappeared about 30 years ago. She went off to grad school in the US somewhere. We were in Canada. Then one day she stopped showing up, and no one knew where she was. Normally, she'd call my mom or her husband about once a week. International long distance calling was very expensive, but then nothing. The thing is, her husband was shady AF. He had a number of businesses that ended up closing under mysterious circumstances, including one business partner found dead in a car trunk. My dad thinks he was involved with some sort of Asian mafia, but I don't know. My dad to this day believes the husband had my aunt murdered for the eventual life insurance settlement. It seems far-fetched to me, but no one has seen or heard from her since. It's equally plausible to me that she disappeared herself in order to start fresh. A year before I was born, my uncle disappeared. I hear different stories about him from various members of my family. My mother comes from a family of 8 children, and John, the one that disappeared, was in the middle. He was so different from the rest of the kids, the black sheep if you will. Had substance abuse problems, would sort of live like a hobo, just different. I hear stories about him from my mom and dad, but my grandma never talks about him, and there are hardly any photos. Nobody ever found out what happened to him, and it's been 28 years. My dad believes he drove his truck off a cliff. My aunt would go to AA meetings just to find him. Spent years trying to track him down. It's such a devastating story, and he seemed like such an interesting, fun, yet troubled guy. My aunt once played Elton John's Daniel My Brother to me and told me how it reminds her of John. How the lyrics perfectly describe the situation for her. Now whenever I hear it I can't help but cry. That's really sad. Another story. There was a family that lived up the next block when I was small. The daughter, Laura, was my age, the son a couple of years younger. Since she was a neighbor and schoolmate we played together often, but it was sort of an antagonistic relationship. Fun but weird. The parents would stroll by on evening walks, all over each other. My dad called him Mr. Milquetoast. The mom ran a Bible study prayer class for kids and I went for a bit, but she got too preachy and my mom had me quit. Jake, the brother, was a whiny, bratty little sneak, forever destroying my toys and screaming. I recall Laura as a bossy, domineering girl. We had a bad argument when we were around 11 and I kept mostly away from her during junior high. She went mean, real mean. She was one of the violent bullies. Then in the middle of the 8th grade she moved away. Her next door neighbor told my mom that the parents had been sexually abusing both kids pretty much all their lives. I remembered Laura telling me that she had to go on trips alone with her dad to establish a relationship with him, and that Jake and the mom were to have a special time when they were gone. I was a naive kid, but I did tell my parents, and after that I was not allowed to visit her. They had moved to another school district and I never saw her again. She disappeared shortly after moving, was last seen getting off the school bus near her house. I will always wonder what happened to her. Did she run? Or was she kidnapped? Or did her parents do something to her? The matter of abuse was going to go to court and both parents had been questioned. Jesus, the end of that story gave me chills. That's terrible and so sad. I hope she's okay out there somewhere. I was too young to really understand what happened, but when I was about 5 my 17-year-old cousin disappeared in a rural Kentucky town. Her car was found off of rural road with purse and wallet in it, door open, her nowhere to be found. She had just finished her shift at the local pizza joint and then left in her car, and it was the last anyone ever saw of her. Getting older I started to understand the unspoken tension in the family and how it really fricks with the dynamic when you don't get closure. I had a breakdown when I turned 15 or 16. All the unfairness and loss I had been too young to process hit me at once. She still hasn't been found, and every once in a while I'll Google stuff about her. The weirdest thing about it all is that it's really affected my childhood and goals in life. Talking to my cousins, aunts, uncles, they also shared this weird if only thought. but for some reason we felt that if we just make an obscene amount of money someday or hold enough power fame in our own life, that we could reopen the case or hire the best dang detective on the earth or buy the best forensic equipment on earth and she'll finally be found. We know she's most likely dead, but almost 20 years without closure really fricks her family up. Her name's Erica Fraser, for anyone wondering. The whole case is baffling and strange. Not super creepy, just kind of crappy and mysterious. When I was 9 or 10 I lived in Sebastian, Florida. It's a small town. My parents worked at a Coa campground. My dad did maintenance and my mom worked in the office and the convenience store. The owners owned a bunch of trailers, like trailer park trailers, not RVs, that they rented out at a discount to staff. We lived in one. My parents were friends with another couple that worked and lived there. I was friends with their son, Brandon. He was a couple years older than me. Brandon's mom was kind of weak mentally, but his stepdad was an butthole. He was emotionally and physically abusive to Brandon. I remember Brandon both craving his stepfather's attention, he'd be ecstatic if they did something together, and terrified by him. I remember one day we were playing in his room and his stepfather called him out into the living room. He asked if he took a bath like he told him to. Brandon said he did. I later remember hearing my dad tell me mom what an butthole he was. He bragged to my dad about how he hid a penny in the washcloth to see if Brandon would lie. When he found out that Brandon didn't take a bath, he beat him. There were a couple of times we ran away together, but it was mainly playing until after dark because he didn't want to go home. I never wanted to run away and he was too scared to go alone. There were a couple of times I told my parents when he begged me to run away with him and they'd sit up until late in the night waiting for the knock on my window. He never went through with it. One day his family moves away. It sucked, but sometimes friends move away. A year later my mom runs into Brandon's mom at the supermarket. When how's Brandon comes up, Brandon's mom says he's no longer with us. My mom said she didn't say anything else, but that was a mind frick for an 11-year-old me. To this day I don't know if that meant he's living with his dad now or he ran away and we never found him, or he killed himself, or his stepdad beat him to death, or CPS took him away. Every so often I'll think about him. Why the frick didn't my mother ask what do you mean or simply not tell me? I would have just thought he moved on with his life, like so many childhood friends we meet. Using a throwaway. I work in the post office. I happen to live in a place where the gov often relocates people. Witness protection, assorted security concerns, etc. It's a good place for it too. Nice but off the beaten path and geographically very secure. We take this extremely seriously and never discuss things outside of the office, even with our spouses. To be clear, no official ever comes in and says the Smith family will be here for 12-16 months in protective hiding and then they will move. Instead you see a family arrive poof overnight and need a house. Now, they are obviously upper middle class, usually, but the cars always have temp tags and they get no incoming mail that's not a utility bill. No family cards at Christmas, nothing. They just appear, live quietly, then leave without a forwarding address a year or two later. Oh, and they always triple lock the front door, even in this quiet community. So I say all this for a single reason. There are times when people are moved by official means and they will never contact anyone from their past lives again. Don't worry, they are very well taken care of. None of them lives in the lower cost apartments around. If there's a chance that your lost loved one could maybe be in this group, then I hope you can move on. From what we see, it's a lot more common than I'd ever thought it would be. It just always struck me as sad that there's no closure for a lot of those people and families. You get to live on, but it's in someone else's life. I hope that helps some. Yes, I had a really good friend in elementary school. We loved Powerpuff Girls and Sims and she slept over a lot. She never talked about her dad really, but from what I remember he was no good. So she lived with her mom. They moved at some point, so we didn't go to school together anymore. But I went over to her house all the time and went to a nearby water park. We stayed friends from 4th grade on through middle school. One day, the old man roommate they lived with, who owned the house, died of a heart attack. My friend called me on the phone from a hotel room to tell me. She told me they were moving, but she didn't know where. We talked for a minute, then my sister got mad because she wanted online, and being these were the days of dial-up, I had to get off. She said she would call me back soon. 14 years later and I have never heard from her again. We had talked every day before that. This is back when you memorize numbers. My number didn't change until I graduated high school. All the numbers I had from her were disconnected. I tried calling our mutual friends. Even tried her longtime boyfriend. Nothing. She never contacted anyone ever again. Just was gone. I even went to her dad's house, who I never met, and asked. The person who lived there said they had never heard of her. I knew that had been her dad's house, so I assumed it must have new owners. When MySpace was a thing, I and old BF looked for her. Same when Facebook came out. Nothing. I still think about her and occasionally search for her. I hope she is okay. She was seriously a really good friend. Late to the party, but I've been reading this thread and realized I also have a story. In first grade there was a blonde boy in my class whom I was fond of, in a 5YO way. He lived down the street from my best friend, so we played together at recess and on weekends, etc. One day his dad dismissed him and his younger sister early from school. They didn't come back. Days went by and we just keep asking where he went. His picture was all over the news and I would watch it at my nanny's house after school. My principal was filmed talking. I remember being excited when I saw her but puzzled by all this. They found his shoe in the woods at one point. I missed him and wanted him to come back to school but was never worried. My mom woke me up one morning before school, sobbing. She told me they found him but he was gone. Being 5, I did not understand, so I kept asking questions. Where was he? They found him in a lake but he can't swim. Honey, he's gone. His daddy hurt him. How? What did he do? He cut his neck and arms and he's dead, honey. This was too much for me to process developmentally, so I think I was coping when I responded with this. If the doctors can just sew him back together. Mom. Sweetheart, it was too late for that. I'm really sorry. This went on for a bit and I continued to protest. I got to school and a child psychologist sat us down on the carpet and put it into language young kids can understand. Then I sobbed. Danny Seguin was his name. His dad murdered his mom Polly, sister Amy, and Danny by drugging them and slitting their wrists and throats. He dumped their bodies in different local bodies of water. It happened in 1990 in Holliston, MA. Took a long time to fully understand what had happened. Sorry for the sloppy writing. Typing this on phone while waiting to exit a plane. God, that is heartbreaking. I just can't understand how someone could do this. My ex-boyfriend's father disappeared one day and his bicycle was found next to a river. He couldn't swim. It was horrible. That one is particularly bad because any number of things could have happened. I'd say 25% chance suicide, 20% chance accident, 5% crime victim, and 50% chance suicide, where he ran off and wanted people to think he'd died. C. She was a very close friend of my family and helped me deal with childhood issues. I looked up to her as a sister figure. Then on what was our last meet in 2009 told me I meant the world to her. Then her number disconnected. No reply to Facebook messages and completely left my life. I sent her birthday and Christmas cards to her last known address until 2011 and then stopped because the silence hurt too much. Wherever you are, I hope you are well and happy. I think of her very often. It changed my entire perspective of life. I'd love to know what I did wrong, or even know that she is okay. I'll never understand how people can up and leave. I think if she took the time to tell you in her last meeting that you meant the world to her, you did not do anything wrong, and the disappearance was only about her. I have an uncle who was kidnapped by the North Koreans in the 1960s. This was in South Korea and I believe he was a college student or in his 20s at the time. A few years ago I hired a private investigator who said there was no trace of him and that this was a very unusual case. He didn't charge me for the search, which was kind of him, but really hard for me to call my mother to tell her. She had to share the bad news with other family members. It's the not knowing that hurts the most. All kinds of terrible thoughts go through your head, wondering and worrying that the person has gone through something terrible. And so of mine disappeared. Not from me, but from his father. Years earlier, in his childhood, he was living in Soviet Belarus with his family. From what I understand, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exactly financially good either since his father was a student. So his mother grew tired of the situation. signed herself up as a mail order bride and just left without a word. My son never saw his father after that and he had just no idea where they went. The father understandingly searched a ton for them according to his grandmother who they were still in contact with. Some 10 years later I convinced him to contact his father and it was pretty amazing. Not together anymore but I'm still glad I managed to improve his life in that way. When I was a kid, a new family moved onto my street and they had a boy my age. We became good friends and hung out at each other's houses pretty often. I never sensed anything weird about the family. He was nice. His little brother was just a normal kid, and his parents were always really nice to me. One thing that I remember specifically is his dad made really great macaroni and cheese. Strange thing to remember, I know. Anyways, all of a sudden they up and disappeared seemingly overnight. There one day, and gone the next. About a year later, I happened to be doing research for a school project on crime in Canada and found my friend's dad on the RCMP wanted list for parole violation. Turns out he was on parole for a second-degree murder committed in the late 80s. What was even weirder was that based on my friend's age and his dad's prison dates, he must have been conceived while his dad was still in prison. Stranger still, his mom used to work in jails, which leads me to believe that she fell for an inmate and had a child with him. To this day, I have no idea where they are. I just hope my friend is okay. I've considered disappearing more than once, and would daydream about plans and how to make it work. This thread has really helped me see how much pain and havoc I would cause to my family. I love them. I'm just afraid I am a failure and a burden on them. But I don't think I could cause them more harm like this than by disappearing without a word. Thanks to all the people who described how much it affected them. The way you see yourself is not how they feel about you. I can guarantee you that. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.